Welcome! If you are coming across my channel for the first time, please like and subscribe. I need to tell you something I have never said in a professional setting. Not to a mentor, not to a coach, not to any of the well-meaning people who told me to be patient and keep my head down and let my work speak for itself. My work spoke for itself for 5 years. Nobody was listening, so I stopped waiting for someone to hand me a microphone, and I went and bought the building the microphone was in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which was not the board meeting, and not the day I wired the funds, and not even the day I first realized what I was dealing with. It started in a hallway on a Wednesday afternoon, when with a hand on my shoulder, and a smile that I have spent considerable time since trying to accurately describe to people. The closest I can get is this. It was the smile of a man who had never once considered that the person he was smiling at might be more dangerous than him. That was Daniel's fundamental problem. And it became, eventually, my greatest advantage. The architecture of being invisible. Let me tell you about the kind of professional invisibility I am describing, because I think people sometimes confuse it with failure. They are not the same thing. Failure is when you try something and it does not work. Invisibility is when you try something and it works perfectly, and then someone else holds it up in the light, and the credit moves, quietly, like water finding a lower level, to a different name. I had been at Caldwell Merrick, a mid-size operational consultancy with about 400 employees and clients in logistics, retail, and infrastructure, for 5 years when this story begins. I joined as a senior operations analyst. I was good at my job in the specific way that is both a blessing and a particular kind of curse. I was good at making complicated things simple, which meant that once I'd solved something, the solution looked obvious. And obvious things don't generate gratitude. They generate the assumption that anyone could have done it. My name is Zara. Not Zara like the clothing store. Zara like my grandmother, who came from a place where names were chosen carefully for weight and meaning. She would have found the events of this story entirely unsurprising. She used to say, "Some people are rivers. They go where the land tells them to, and some people are what shapes the land in the first place." She meant it as a compliment. It took me until I was 34 years old to fully understand what it required of me. Daniel Forsyth was my direct supervisor for the last 3 of those 5 years. He had the specific quality of a man who had been told he was exceptional so many times throughout his life that he'd stopped questioning it and started just administering it, like a fact of nature. He was well-dressed in the way that people notice without being able to describe afterward. He had a handshake that lasted slightly too long, and a habit of summarizing other people's ideas back to them in meetings as if he'd arrived at the conclusions independently. I noticed this the first week. I said nothing because I was new, and because I thought it was temporary, and because I made the very common mistake of believing that patterns correct themselves over time if you're patient and competent and just keep doing good work. They don't. Patterns only change when the cost of continuing them becomes greater than the cost of stopping. I was going to be the cost. My first year at Caldwell Merrick, I rebuilt the vendor negotiation framework from scratch. The old system had been designed in 2016, which in operational terms is approximately the Stone Age, and it was leaking somewhere between 8 and 11% on every major contract renewal. I found it. I fixed it. I documented everything. Presented it to Daniel. Daniel presented it to the quarterly leadership review as his Strategic Vendor Realignment Initiative. I was mentioned in the acknowledgement slide as having contributed analysis. 2 years later, the framework had saved the company just over $3 million. The acknowledgement slide was nowhere to be found. I automated 3 internal reporting pipelines that had previously required manual input from 2 full-time junior staff. The junior staff were reassigned to higher value work. The efficiency gain was documented. Daniel included it in his year-end review under the heading Department Innovation. I built a client retention model that marketing still uses. I restructured the onboarding process for new operational accounts. I wrote the compliance documentation that kept us out of a very uncomfortable situation with one of our infrastructure clients in year 4. In all of that time, here is what I received. A 7% raise at the end of year 2, described as exceptional. A good review that said I was invaluable to the team. And, once, from Daniel, the specific compliment that I would come to understand as the most expensive thing he ever said to me. "Zara," he said after I'd resolved a billing crisis that had been escalating for 3 weeks in about 4 days. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He meant it as appreciation. He did not mean it as a business assessment. I was starting to understand the difference. There is a kind of anger that comes from being overlooked that I want to describe carefully, because I think people expect it to be hot and it isn't. Not after enough time. After enough time, it gets cold and very precise, like a tool that has been sharpened so many times, it no longer requires force. You just apply pressure in exactly the right place. I was at that stage by year 4. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't doing that thing where you complain to your colleagues or post cryptic things or let the frustration leak into your performance. I still showed up completely. I still solved the problems. I still made Caldwell Merrick more money than anyone in that building understood. But I had started to think differently about the situation. Specifically, I had started to think about exit. Not the kind of exit where you update your resume and start taking recruiter calls and eventually leave to do the same thing somewhere else for slightly better pay. The other kind, the kind where you change the terms of the entire relationship so fundamentally that the concept of leaving becomes irrelevant because you're no longer in the position that needed leaving. I'd been quietly building towards something, but I didn't know yet exactly what shape it would take. That shape arrived in the form of a board meeting, a condescending sentence, and the specific expression on Daniel's face when he delivered it, which I have already described, and which I will never forget, and which served, in the end, as the fuel for everything that came after. The room that made me the board meeting was a quarterly review. Sanal Q, 3 results, plus a restructuring proposal that had been on the agenda for 2 cycles and kept getting pushed. I had prepared the restructuring proposal. Let me be accurate. I had spent 6 months preparing the restructuring proposal. Not because anyone asked me to, because I had been watching the company's operational inefficiencies stack for long enough that I had both the data and the solution, and at that point it felt almost irresponsible not to build the case formally. The proposal covered 3 things: a reorganization of the client services division that would reduce overhead by approximately $1.2 million annually, a revised billing structure that would recapture revenue being lost in contract renewal gaps, and a technology integration that would reduce our manual reporting burden by about 60%. I had tested every number. I had run scenarios. I had prepared slides that were clear and specific and did not hide from the hard parts. I had a backup deck for the questions I expected, and a risk assessment for the ones I didn't. Daniel had reviewed the proposal 2 weeks earlier. He'd made 2 small edits, both stylistic, and said, "Good work. Very thorough." At the board meeting, he introduced the proposal as an initiative we've been developing strategically at the department level. I was in the room. I was going to present it. That had been the plan. Daniel would introduce the context, I would walk through the data and the recommendations, and we would field questions together. I had my laptop open. I had the slides queued. I was ready. I got through the executive summary and the first 2 sections before Daniel interrupted me. He did it smoothly. He was always smooth. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, the way people do when they're about to say something they've decided sounds better in their own voice, and he said, "I want to jump in here." I stopped. He took about 4 minutes to rephrase what I'd just said. The board listened to him differently than they'd been listening to me. I noticed this in real time. There was a different quality of attention, a different alignment of posture. Like a room that had been slightly off-angle, settling into plumb. I watched it happen. He went through the rest of my slides himself. I sat to his left with my laptop still open and nothing left to say. Afterward, when most of the board was chatting in small groups and the catering had arrived, a man named Osmond Veth, one of the senior investors, Chit had been on the board for something like 9 years, quiet but clearly watching everything, caught my eye across the room and gave me a look I didn't fully understand until later. Not pity, something more specific, like recognition. I made a note of it. Then Daniel came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Great supporting work," he said. "The board is impressed with the analysis." I said thank you. What I thought was, "Get your hand off my shoulder." What I also thought was, "This is the last time." I didn't know yet what I meant by that, specifically, but something had completed in that moment. Some final calculation had run. The last time this would happen without consequence. 3 days after the board meeting, Osmond Veth emailed me directly, not through Daniel, not CCing anyone, directly to my work email, which he had found through the company directory. The email was 4 sentences. It said, "Zara, your analysis in Thursday's presentation was precise and well-structured. I've rarely seen restructuring logic that clean. I have a question about the billing recapture model. Would you be willing to walk me through it? Coffee this week if you're available." I read it twice. Then I replied and said yes. What I knew that nobody knew before I tell you about the coffee with Osmond, I need to tell you about my background. Not because I want to be impressive about it, actually the opposite, but because the story doesn't make sense without it, and I think the fact that I'd hidden it is important. 4 years before I joined Caldwell Merrick, I was part of a small logistics software startup called Lanebridge. Not a founder, not from the beginning, but early enough that I had an equity stake, and senior enough by the exit that the stake was meaningful. Lanebridge was acquired in a mid-sized deal. Nothing that made news. The kind of quiet, competent exit that happens every year in the tech-adjacent world, and that people outside of that world never hear about. I came away with enough money to be comfortable for a long time, invested quietly, conservatively, the kind of portfolio that doesn't excite anyone at a dinner party, but also doesn't keep you awake at night. I joined Caldwell Merrick because I was interested in the operational side of consultancy, and I wanted to learn something new. I was not there because I needed the salary. I was there because it was genuinely interesting work, and I thought it would be a good chapter. I had not told anyone this. Not because I was ashamed or secretive as a personality, I'm not, but because I had learned, through the Lanebridge years, that money changes the way people interact with you before it changes anything else. And I wanted to be evaluated on my work. I wanted to know if I was genuinely good at what I did, or if I was good at having resources that made other people act like I was good. I found out I was genuinely good. Unfortunately, so did Daniel, in the specific way that causes certain kinds of managers to quietly take ownership of people who are more capable than they are. Which is to say, he found out I was useful and then organized his professional life around making sure I remained useful to him without becoming a threat. He did not know about Lanebridge. He did not know about the investments. Why he did not know that the person he had just described as not leadership material in front of a room full of decision-makers had in fact complete financial independence and the quiet inclination to use it. That was the gap. And I had been watching it for long enough to know exactly where to step. The coffee with Osmond happened on a Thursday morning at a place he suggested near the financial district. Small. Not the kind of place you pick if you want to be seen. The kind you pick if you want to talk. He was already there when I arrived. He had ordered coffee for both of us and a pastry he didn't touch, which I suspected was a habit from years of breakfast meetings where eating was somehow at odds with the tone he was trying to set. He asked about the billing recapture model. I walked him through it. Yet he asked good questions, not performative questions designed to signal intelligence, actual questions designed to understand something. I appreciated that. When we'd finished going through the model, he leaned back and said, "Who built the rest of it? The restructuring proposal?" I said, "I did." He said, "All of it?" I said, "All of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been on this board for 9 years. I've watched a lot of very talented people get managed into corners by people who understood politics better than they understood anything else." He picked up his coffee. "The proposal you built is the best operational restructuring case I've seen from inside this company. I'm curious what you're going to do with that. I said, I'm still working on that. He smiled. Work faster. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, the difference between a contributor and a stakeholder is not talent. It's not even strategy. It's where your name sits in the legal documents. Everything else is just noise. I drove back to the office, and I sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes, not going inside. Where your name sits in the legal documents. I thought about that. I thought about the board meeting. I thought about the slide that said, Strategic Department Initiative. I thought about the name in the acknowledgments versus the name at the top. I went home that night and started reading. The window that nobody told me was open. What I found, over 3 weeks of quiet research, was this. Caldwell Merrick had gone through a capital restructuring about 2 years prior. In the process, a secondary equity tranche had been created. Smaller allocations, not part of the public stock structure, but set aside for what the filing language called strategic stakeholder acquisition. It was the kind of mechanism that gets built into restructurings to give the company flexibility later. Most companies build them and never use them. Some do. One of the original board members, a man named Philip Ekimpong, who had been there from the early days and had apparently decided that turning 70 was a reasonable point to step back from active investment, was quietly divesting. His stake was 12%. Minority, but it was what the filings called a concentrated block, large enough to trigger certain board rights, including the right to appoint a representative and participate in major strategic decisions. It was not on the open market. It was being handled privately, through counsel, for someone who already knew the company well enough to want in. The question was whether I could get to it first. I spent 1 week just asking myself if this was actually what I wanted to do. Because it was not a small thing. It was a significant capital commitment. It meant going from employee to stakeholder in a company where my boss had just told a room full of people that I wasn't leadership material. It meant every professional in that building would know, from a public filing, that I had moved. The more I thought about it, the more that second part felt like a feature rather than a problem. I called a lawyer I'd worked with during the Lane Bridge exit. Her name is Constance, and she is one of those people who seems almost visually unimpressed by everything, which in a legal context is tremendously reassuring. I told her what I was looking at. She said, "Send me the filings." I sent them. She called back in 48 hours. She said, "It's clean. The block is legitimate, the rights are clear, and if you can reach Philip Ekimpong through the right channel, there's nothing stopping you from making an offer." I said, "How do I reach him through the right channel?" She said, "You already know someone who does." Osmond. I emailed Osmond. Not about the stake, not directly. I asked if he'd be open to a second coffee, said I'd been thinking about what he mentioned regarding stakeholder positioning and wanted to continue the conversation. He replied within an hour. Same place. Tuesday. At Tuesday's coffee, I laid it out. I told him I was looking at the Ekimpong block. I told him I had the capital. I told him I was not doing it impulsively or emotionally, that I had analyzed the company's value, the terms of the block, and the rights that came with it, and that my assessment was that it was a sound investment on pure financial logic, independent of any other consideration. He listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, "And the other considerations?" I said, "Those are mine to manage." He nodded, said he'd make an introduction. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, "Does Daniel know you have this kind of capital access?" I said, "No." He picked up his coffee, said, "Good." The longest silence I've ever kept. The 2 months between my first conversation with Constance and the day the filing went live were the strangest professional experience of my life. I showed up to work every day the same way I always had. Same time, same navy blazer I rotated with 2 others, same desk, same meetings, same careful, thorough, invisible work that kept the company running at a level nobody fully mapped. I fixed 3 operational problems during those 2 months, one of which was genuinely complex and took 10 days of detailed work. I presented one analysis to the leadership team. I answered questions from Daniel's new external VP hire, a man named Trevor, who had arrived with enormous confidence and almost no institutional knowledge, and who had taken to stopping by my desk with questions I answered at a level just helpful enough to not be obstructive and just incomplete enough to require follow-up. Nobody suspected anything, not because I was performing secrecy. I was just doing what I'd always done. I had always been the person in the room who was doing more than anyone realized. The only difference now was that I knew exactly what the doing was building toward. The negotiations with Philip Achimpong happened through Constance and Osmond's channel. I met Philip once, briefly, over a video call. He was a warm man in his early 70s who had spent 40 years building and backing businesses and had reached the stage where he wanted to play golf in the mornings and not read quarterly reports in the evenings. He asked me 2 questions. First, did I understand what I was buying? Second, was I planning to be disruptive to the company he'd spent 15 years building? I said yes to the first and no to the second. He said, good enough. The funds transferred on a Friday. The filing would go live the following Wednesday. I went home that Friday evening and sat at my kitchen table and ate a bowl of rice and beans that I had cooked too much of and would probably be eating for 3 more days. And I felt something I had not felt in 5 years of this particular chapter of my professional life. Not triumph, not yet. Something quieter than that. The specific relief of a person who has been holding a thing very tightly for a very long time and has just, finally, set it down somewhere permanent. The Monday before the filing went live, Daniel held a leadership check-in. These were bi-weekly and generally served the function of Daniel reminding everyone that he existed and had opinions. At this particular check-in, he said, and I am not embellishing this because I wrote it down word for word when I got back to my desk. He said, "We need to think about long-term commitment from everyone in this room. The people who grow with this company are the people who see themselves as part of its future, not just employees collecting a paycheck." He looked around the room as he said this. His eyes passed over me without stopping. "Ownership mentality," he said. That's what we're looking for." I wrote it down. I did not smile, but something in my chest did the specific thing it does when a situation becomes, in the fullest sense of the word, complete. Ownership mentality, noted. 7:42 a.m. The SEC filing went live at 7:42 a.m. on a Wednesday. I was at my desk at 7:58 when the first message came in. It was from someone in the finance department, a woman named Bridget who sat 2 floors up and with whom I had never exchanged anything beyond pleasantries in the elevator. The message said simply, "Is this you?" with the filing link attached. I said yes. My phone buzzed 7 more times in the next 4 minutes. Colleagues. A former colleague at another firm who'd somehow seen it. 2 people I barely knew from other departments. Daniel had not called. At 8:31, his assistant, a quietly efficient man named Marcus, who I'd always suspected saw everything and said nothing, appeared at my desk and said, "Daniel would like to see you." I said I'd be there in 10 minutes. I used those 10 minutes to do something specific. I went to the bathroom, stood at the sink, looked at myself in the mirror the way you do when you are preparing to be in a room where the dynamic has just permanently changed and you want to make sure your face understands what your mind has already decided. Then I went. Daniel's office had a glass wall facing the main floor. When I walked up, I could see him through it, standing behind his desk. Not sitting. Standing, with his arms crossed, looking at his computer screen. He heard me come in, turned. His face had a quality I had never seen on it before in 5 years of watching it deliver assessments and directives and smiles that didn't reach his eyes. He looked uncertain, not angry, or at least not only angry. There was something running underneath the anger that I recognized because I had lived with its opposite for years. He was calculating, reordering things, trying to figure out how the map had changed and where he was standing on the new version of it. He said, "Close the door." I did. He said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said, "Long enough." He said, "Why didn't you say something? Talk to me? There were ways we could have." I said, "Ways we could have what, Daniel?" He stopped. I said, "I want to be clear about something. This is not about you. This is a financial investment in a company I understand well and believe in. The fact that I work here is not the reason I bought shares. It's just one of the reasons I was well positioned to see the opportunity." He stared at me. I said, "Is there anything else?" He said, "You understand this changes things." I said, "Yes, that's generally what investments do." The formal board meeting was moved up to Thursday of that week. I was in the room as a participant now, not a presenter. That distinction sounds small, and is not small at all. There is a difference between a person who is in a room to deliver information and a person who is in a room because their name is in the legal documents and their presence is not optional. Osmond nodded at me when I sat down. No one else acknowledged me directly, but I was aware of being seen in a way that was different from every previous time I had sat in a room with these people. Daniel opened the meeting. He got through the opening remarks and moved to the first agenda item, which was, with spectacular timing, a review of the Q3 restructuring proposal. And before he could continue, I spoke. I said, "Before we move into agenda items, I'd like to formally acknowledge my position as a beneficial owner and stakeholder of record, and express that I'm looking forward to contributing constructively to the board's work." Formal, calm, documented. The room held its breath for a moment. Then I added, looking at no one in particular, "I know there was some question, not long ago, about whether I was leadership material." A pause. "I appreciate the opportunity to revisit that." The restructuring of power. What happened next did not happen in a single dramatic moment. I want to be honest about that, because the stories that make it seem like power shifts in an instant are leaving out the part that actually matters. The weeks after. The slow rearrangement. The meetings where the dynamic has changed, but the old structure is still standing, and you have to live inside both simultaneously while one gradually replaces the other. Osmond moved, at that Thursday meeting, to formally commission a review of the Q3 restructuring proposal. The same one Daniel had presented as a department initiative, and then steered away from when it became politically complicated. The same one I had built over 6 months. 2 board members seconded it immediately. Daniel did not object. He couldn't. Objecting to a shareholder motion on the grounds that you personally didn't want it would have required an explanation that he wasn't equipped to give. The review was assigned to an independent subcommittee. I was included on that subcommittee. It was the first time my name had been on a formal board document in any capacity other than support staff. Over the following weeks, several things happened in an order that felt, if not inevitable, at least logical. The subcommittee reviewed the proposal. They came back with a recommendation to implement it in phases, starting with the billing structure revision. The financial projections held. The logic was sound. The board approved it. My name was on the implementation plan as lead architect, not Daniel's. Daniel's role in the implementation was described in the documentation, say as executive liaison, which is the specific corporate language for a role that sounds important and is primarily administrative. He did not argue about this. I think by then he understood that argument was expensive, and he was low on capital, both literally and otherwise. He continued to run the department. He continued to have his title. He continued to attend meetings and set agendas and do the things that department heads do. None of that changed. What changed was the perimeter of his authority. The things he had been able to do because there was no structure holding him accountable, presenting other people's work, making unilateral decisions, filtering information before it reached the board. Those things became more difficult when there was someone in the room with the standing to say, "Actually, let's look at that more closely." He never fully recovered his previous confidence in my presence. I noticed this not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the specific clarity of a person who has finished a calculation and found the answer correct. 3 months after the filing, the billing recapture model I'd built generated its first full quarter of results. The number came in at about $800,000 of recovered revenue, above the previous baseline. Daniel mentioned it in the monthly company update. He said, "We're seeing strong returns from our strategic billing optimization initiative." I was on the call. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The conversation I didn't expect. About 4 months after everything, Daniel appeared at my office door. Not his office, mine. The one I'd moved into when the subcommittee work became a formal role. He knocked, which he had never done before. He had always been the kind of person who opened doors on his way through them. I said, "Come in." He sat down in the chair across from my desk. He had his hands in his lap, which was unusual for a man who normally occupied space with his whole body. He said, "I want to say something." I waited. He said, "I think I made a significant error in how I assessed you, and I made an error in how I treated your work." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to ask if there's a working relationship that can exist from here." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Daniel, I don't have a problem working with you. I never did. My issue was never personal. It was structural. The structure has changed. So yes, we can work together." He nodded. I said, "But I need you to understand one thing." He waited. I said, "I'm not going to manage your comfort with my success. I'm not going to make myself smaller to make this easier. If that's what functional requires, then we have a different problem." He said, "That's fair." And then he left. It was the most honest conversation I'd had with him in 5 years, which should probably tell you something. What it actually feels like, 6 months after the filing. I'm going to tell you what this actually felt like, because the way these stories get told usually skips this part, and I think skipping it is a disservice. It didn't feel like winning. Not the clean, cinematic version of winning that comes with music and a clean horizon, and the sense that everything has resolved into clarity. So it felt like the specific exhaustion of having run very far in a very deliberate direction and arriving somewhere that required the same energy to maintain as it had required to reach. The work didn't stop. The complexity didn't simplify. The company still had problems. I still had to solve them. The meetings were still long, and the decisions were still difficult, and there were still days when I drove home wondering what I was building and whether it was worth the specific shape of effort required. What was different was this. My name was in the documents now. When I solved something, there was no longer a mechanism by which it could be transferred. When I built something, it was mine. When I spoke in a room, I spoke as a person with standing, not as a person whose standing was managed by someone else. That sounds simple. It is not simple. It is the entire difference. Tobias, Achimpong, not the baby from the other story, Philip's son, who'd been loosely involved in the handover process, called me about 6 months after the acquisition. We had stayed in occasional contact. He said, "My father said something about you. He said you were the first person in years who answered his 2 questions correctly." I said, "What were his 2 questions again?" He laughed, said, "Do you know what you're buying, and are you going to break what someone else built?" I said, "And what was the correct answer?" He said the correct answer to the first question was yes, and the correct answer to the second was no. But he said the real signal wasn't the words. It was the order. He said most people who are in it for the wrong reasons answer the second question first. They lead with, "I don't want to cause trouble," because that's what they think you want to hear. I thought about that. "You answered the first question first," Tobias said. He said that meant you actually knew what you were there for. I want to go back to Daniel's sentence for a moment, because I think it deserves a final accounting. You're not leadership material. He was trying to put me in a category, the category of people who build things for other people to lead, the category that produces the actual architecture of a company while someone else holds the key. And in a specific technical sense, he was right. I was not leadership material as he defined it. I was not a person who would perform authority on his behalf. I was not a person who would trade my competence for his proximity to power. I was not a person who would keep making him look good in rooms that could have contained my own name. He was looking for a very specific kind of leadership material, and I was not it. What I was, it turned out, was the other kind. The kind that doesn't wait to be promoted. The kind that doesn't wait to be recognized. The kind that reads the filings and makes the calls and wires the funds and sits in the room not because someone gave them a seat, but because they own one. I still have the slide from the first board meeting, the one that was still glowing behind me when Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled. I took a screenshot of it on my phone, and I still have it in a folder I've never deleted. Not as a reminder of humiliation. I am not interested in humiliation as a motivating force. It's too expensive, too corrosive, requires too much maintenance. I keep it because it's a record of the exact moment before. The exact moment when the room thought they knew what I was and what I wasn't. I think about that moment sometimes, and I don't feel anger. I feel something closer to gratitude, which I know sounds strange, and which I don't mean in the easy, performed way. I mean it in the specific way of a person who understands that being underestimated is only a wound if you let it be a wound. If you let it be information, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a map of exactly where the gap is, and I am very good at finding gaps. Someone asked me recently if I had any advice for people in a similar position. The invisible architect position. The person who builds things while someone else holds the title position. I said, document everything. Not obsessively, not in a way that makes you paranoid, but in the way that you would document any asset you planned to eventually present to a decision maker. Because that's what your work is. It's an asset, and assets require records. I said, find out who is actually watching. In every room, there is at least one person who is watching without the constraints of politics. Find them. Not to complain to them, not to campaign with them, just to make sure that the gap between your invisibility and your actual contribution has at least one witness. And I said, know your numbers. All of them. Personal and professional. Because the moment you understand your options, you stop being at the mercy of the people who assume you don't have any. Daniel assumed I needed the job. I didn't. That gap, between what he assumed and what was true, was 12% of the company. And it was sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone who knew what to do with a gap. The last thing I'll tell you is this. The first board meeting after the acquisition, Osmond Veth arrived early, the way he always did. He set his papers down, and then he looked across the table at me. He said quietly, before anyone else had come in, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. I said, like I've been speaking a language for 5 years that nobody in the room was fluent in, and now there are documents. He smiled, said, "That's the most accurate description of equity I've ever heard." And then the room filled up, and the meeting started. And this time, when my name came up in the documents, it was at the top. Not the acknowledgments, not the supporting analysis. The top. And I sat in that room, in that chair, in that company that had decided I wasn't leadership material. And I thought about my grandmother, who said some people are rivers, and some people are what shapes the land. I thought about the 5 years. I thought about the flickering light. No, wait, that's a different story. I thought about Daniel's smile in that hallway, and I thought, he was right that I wasn't the kind of material he was looking for. He just never asked what kind I actually was. Now he knows. They all do. If this story found you at a moment when someone is treating your competence like furniture, share it, not for me. For the person in that office right now, holding their work under their arm, waiting for someone to ask what they built. The question is coming. Make sure you're ready for it. Don't forget to smash the subscribe button and like, pleasey!